Color, AccuQuilt's cutting expert. I'm here today with the amazing Luke Haynes, who is one of my favorite quilt designers. Welcome, Luke.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to be here.
Now, Luke's quilts are actually hanging right here in our gallery today. So should we go take a look?
Yeah, let's go look.
So Luke, this is one of the first quilts in our gallery. Tell me about what kind of a collection it came from and how you discovered what kind of pattern you wanted to create.
So this is from a series I made called The Log Cabins of Luke Haynes, and it's all this reference to kind of 1970s minimalist art where you take a lot of geometry and simple materiality and work from there. So referencing kind of Donald Judd or Dan Flavin, these different kind of Richard Serra artists. And then what I decided in quilting, the kind of base vernacular is the block. So I wanted to take one of those and go forward as far as I could with it from kind of a design perspective. So the first repeatable quilt block unit, arguably, is the log cabin. So I took that block and tried it in as many different ways as I could. So I made a series of 50 quilts using that block.
So every one of the quilts has a different pattern.
Yeah, so they're all different ways of using the same block type.
Oh, perfect. Let's look at the next one.
Sure.
All right, so let's talk about this quilt. Now this seems like it's not a traditional log cabin pattern. Tell me a little bit about it.
Sure, so it's done in the same methodology of log cabin. So you start with the center square and you build your way out. So the log cabin traditional block sort of references the log cabin architecture, right? You start with kind of the hearth, and that's why I chose red. Traditionally red is important for that, the hearth, and then you build your way around in layers like that. So as you would kind of a log cabin where you build the logs around till you get to the roof. I've done that here, but instead of alternating two colors to create sort of a bifurcated block, I've done it row by row.
Excellent. So did you use any of our AccuQuilt dies to make some of your quilts?
Sure, so you're able to use the strip dies, and these are all deconstructed clothing, so it's really easy to take the panels from clothing and sheets and all the reclaimed textiles and put them through those dies and just get the strips that I need to make the blocks.
Perfect. And why do you choose reclaimed fabric?
Well, so using reclaimed clothing, reclaimed textiles has a story to it. So each of the materials themselves, you can kind of come forward and find a little entry point, like, Bugs Bunny and Tweety Bird, these little kind of fluffy kid sheets or, different shirts. I mean, I find that when people come to this exhibition, they often find some entry point through the material, which references a lot of the ideas from kind of minimal art, where the material becomes really important. And it gives people an entry point to quilts that maybe don't necessarily know about quilting as a history or aren't too in-depth into the kind of community of it. They can still come and say, oh, I understand that fabric, and then they can look at the material and then step back and look at the quilt.
So when you're creating a quilt, do you choose the fabric randomly, or do you kind of have a specific? You want to have these colors and these colors, or do you just have it all in a bag and grab it and sew?
So I designed by color. So in this case, the rules for this show is red centers to represent the hearth, then white and black fabric. And so there's the division of the two colors, but within what was white and what is black at the Goodwill, where I'll buy the 1,000 pounds of clothing, right. I'll divide it into those piles, then cut it up. And so I'll just dig from that randomly. So both is the answer.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's check out my favorite one in your collection.
Sure.
So of all the quilts in the collection, this is my favorite, and I think it's because it's a typical traditional log cabin block. So tell me about your inspiration to create a traditional one, because you've kind of thought outside the box for all the others.
Right, well, so this one, again, what I'm trying to do is understand some of the ways of using this very traditional block. And in order to understand something that's very traditional, use the language that it was used traditionally. So this particular layout for the blocks is one that's very sort of, it makes a lot of sense, right? If you have these half blocks, one side one color, one side the other, you can make these diagonal stripes really, really easily. So starting from there to sort of generate some ideas on layout, starting from tradition and working their way to kind of more modern or esoteric.
And so was this the easiest one to create out of all of them?
I mean,
As far as the piecing?
no, I mean, they weren't any different. Like this block is the same as, I mean, probably 15 of the quilts in this series were made using this exact same, very traditional, simple, the same size logs as blocks. So it wasn't any harder or easier than any of the rest of them because, I mean, the blocks took, forever to make. And yeah, for this one as any of the other ones, yeah.
Just the same. So do you have any of your own personal clothing in any of your quilts in the group?
Actually, the opposite happened far more often when I would go buy 100 pounds of this color or this color, and I would actually find something that fit me. So I would actually take it out and use it for my clothes as opposed to putting it in. I would like to say that my stuff migrated back, but that's not true.
That's great. Well, let's check out this last one.
Sure.
All right, so we've kind of talked about the pattern and we've kind of talked about the materials you use. What about the quilting? Is the quilting the same in every quilt?
So the whole idea behind this series was to re-understand the log cabin block and think of it in different ways. And so I made a couple of rules for myself. The centers were red. I used white and black fabric, all reclaimed, all the same size, 90 by 90. And the quilting just mirrored the fabric. So horizontal in the black, vertical in the white, no quilting in the red, because you could make the same quilt and quilt it 50 different ways. So you could add a whole nother element that made it more complex. So I had to create some systems so that the only thing that changed was the block and the block layout. So as I was trying to understand the design of quilting, I was only changing a few variables.
So now, this is not your typical kind of pieces of art that you make, right? You live in Kansas City, you travel all over the world. Tell us kind of some of the other things that you do with your quilting and your artistry.
Sure. So this series came after, I mean, this probably was my 250th to 300th quilt that I've made, but to kind of understand more about quilting history, because before this I was making figural work and doing some quilt piecing, but I didn't have any entry point from a history standpoint or an understanding. I was more using it from a design element, and so I wanted to understand more about quilting historically, so taking that block. But I made a lot of figural work prior, and that's a lot of the work that kind of goes out around the world and I lecture about in different countries and there are different museums around the world, which is really cool.
Which is cool. So it's just amazing. We actually here at AccuQuilt are so honored to have one of your original pieces. It's entitled Madam X, and let's go talk about it.
Yeah, excited.
So this is Madam X. She is part of our permanent collection here at AccuQuilt, and we are so honored to have her here. Tell us a little bit about this piece of art.
So this piece right here references a famous John Singer Sargent painting called Madam X, but in the case of this one, it's got a friend of mine in the posture. So it's referencing the painting, kind of this collision of craft and art, because so often in my career people say, oh, what do you do? I say, I make quilts, and they say, oh, craft fairs, do you give them away? There's this kind of idea of valuelessness in quilting. So if I'm referencing these famous art, which are all kind of assumed to be priceless pieces, artifacts of art, referencing that really makes my objects important, or the interest of sort of bringing quilts up and elevating them to the level of art. So referencing these postures helped me talk about that conversation.
And what was the process for making Madam X? Because it's not similar to the log cabin at all.
Right. So it actually has a log cabin in the background. So I made the background sort of the traditional field upon which, and then I had a friend of mine sit for photos, and then taking one of those photos, working from it, making the posture of the person and putting it on top. So this applique, so this traditional behind and this modern applique, kind of again talking about art versus quilts, craft, and kind of elevating everything together.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming by and visiting with us today. This has been an amazing quilt gallery exhibit. It's going to be here till the end of August. So thanks again for coming.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's great.